Thank you for all of those joining us today. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Michaela Lowenz, and I'm an active member of the Migrant Investor and Entrepreneur Association. So first and foremost, I want to welcome you to today's program. We're going to be discussing Jbwere's Calls Report, and it's a combination. It's co-hosted by MIEA, Immigration New Zealand will join us, of course, the Bank of New Zealand, and Jbwere Wealth Management. So I'll briefly go through today's agenda, but as a matter of housekeeping, feel free to ask any questions in the chat function. I'll read them out towards the end of today's session, but it would be great if we could keep it the questions to topic. So if you have any questions related, say, to like immigration policy or like, you can certainly email me or David Wayne directly. I'll put our details in the chat function shortly, and we'll point you in the right direction. But if we can stay on point today, that'd be great. As a little bit of context, over the last year, David Wang and I have been frequently approached by MIEA members asking for both sort of for-purpose investment opportunities as well as advice around New Zealand's charitable sector. So today's webinar is really geared towards introducing to you what I'd consider as the thought leaders in this space and some of the opportunities in New Zealand's philanthropic sector. So first today we'll be joined by Matt Hoskins, who will share New Zealand's immigration's perspective and philosophy on philanthropy from like a policy perspective. And then we'll hear from David O'Fell, who's one of our fellow MIEA members, and he'll just impart his sort of personal experience in getting established in New Zealand and with a lens towards how you can incorporate the philanthropic sector into your portfolio. And then the real crux of today, we're going to be joined by our co-host, Evan Veza, from the Bank of New Zealand. He heads up international business there, and his colleagues at Jbwere Wealth Management, John Moore and John McLeod. Both are widely considered leaders in the philanthropic service and are probably the first point of call for anyone thinking about the space. So as it kind of to that point, like when I think of the for-purpose sector, Jbwere has always sprung to mind. From those of you who may not be familiar, Jbwere Wealth Management is a leading wealth manager in New Zealand. They've got the big footprint also in Australia. And as I understand it, they are the only ones who currently have a designated philanthropic service team. They offer advice on for-purpose investment strategies. And I know from experience, they've kept very close tabs on all the philanthropic opportunities available in New Zealand. So without further ado, I'll hand over to Matt from Immigration New Zealand.
Hello, kia ora. Yeah, all good now. You've unmuted me, so I can speak. Kia ora, everybody. My name's Matt Hoskin. I've led the Investor Migrant Program for the last 12 years, with the last 2 or 3 being particularly challenging, as you can imagine, right across the immigration system. So personally, I'd just like to say it's great to see David in New Zealand. David and I have been in touch many times over the last 2 years, and I know why that grin is as wide as the Auckland Harbour Bridge, David. So congratulations and welcome to New Zealand, mate. Thank you. Pleasure. Look, over the last 12 years, first of all, I'd like to say, while my back was turned with border closures, etc., you've gone and rebranded the sector as for purpose as opposed to philanthropy. So that's going to take me a while to wrap my head around that one. But over the last 12 years, there's a question that I've got in my mind. Certainly something when we've engaged with investors, particularly from certain parts of the world, philanthropy is something that really started to come up, particularly when engaging with the investors from the US market. Now, what I'm not sure is the interest in it from a New Zealand perspective because there are more migrant investors in New Zealand? Or is it just that New Zealand's caught up? I don't know the answer to that question, but when I was reading the report, there was a line in it that struck me, and that was the activities of the for-purpose sector are the fabric of our society. And when I was thinking about the role that investors and migrants of all types play in New Zealand and their aspirations for coming to New Zealand, that really hit home with me, because for me, that really mirrors the intent that migrants bring with them. All the migrant investors I've met, and there's been a fair few, they're not making a decision based on the bottom line. This is not about the return they can get. Of course, the return is important, I realise that, but migration to New Zealand is what they're after. And it's a decision very much led by their heart. And so I think this discussion around the for-purpose sector is really important, because we should give migrants and investors as holistic an experience and an opportunity as we possibly can, because each migrant journey is as unique as the migrant and their family themselves. And just to finish, I think, what's really important about this is the really underpinning driver for migrants, again, in my experience, is that they want to contribute to New Zealand, whether that be economically, whether that be culturally, whether that be socially. And I think this is just another opportunity for them to do so. And I think it's really good that we're actively talking about this in a way that we probably weren't 10 or 12 years ago. So thank you very much. I'll hand back to you, Michaela.
Thanks, Matt. I think that leads very easily and effortlessly into David O'Fell. As I said, he's one of our migrant investors, and he can kind of share you firsthand his experience in establishing himself in New Zealand. Thanks, David.
Great. Can you hear me okay, Michaela?
Yeah, you're great on my end.
Okay, great. So thank you for having me. Short of a minor hiccup known as COVID, my experience with the process of coming through as a migrant investor was very, very smooth. I felt supported throughout the entire exercise. The Immigration New Zealand folks were great. I got a chance to meet Matt Hoskin early in the process. He was helpful to me when it was hard for me to understand what was going on during this 2-year quiet period. He shared with me what he could. Anthony Moss, Melinda Lehman, and Butch Swindells, all who are representatives in the United States, also reached out regularly to me throughout the course of that process. So I just want to extend kudos to Immigration New Zealand. They did make me feel very cared for and important to them as I came through this process. Number two, around the context of philanthropy. Philanthropy is something that's important to me and my family in the United States where we live. And coming to New Zealand, it was our intent to continue to engage in philanthropic activity as we came here. But not knowing the first thing about what ecosystem existed, Michaela was kind enough to introduce me to John Morrow. And John and I have had a few conversations, and he was super helpful for me to better understand the ecosystem in New Zealand around philanthropy. Clearly there are some rules and regulations about donative funds and where they can be invested, where they have to maintain that donative intent as we migrate from the US to New Zealand. So I felt like I've gotten some clarity around that. The other thing that is important to us in our philanthropy is really understanding the landscape of organization, a nonprofit or for-cause organizations, and trying to get some qualitative information around the nature of these. Donative impact is something that's really important. So, how much of my dollar is actually getting to the mission versus the cost of administration of a nonprofit organization. That's a hot spot for me in terms of our giving. And John has been helpful in helping me understand that landscape. So I'm excited to come here. As Matt said, I just arrived a couple of weeks ago after a 2-year hiatus, but I'm super excited to be here and look forward to engaging in a whole host of aspects in New Zealand, but philanthropy certainly being one of those.
Thanks, Michaela. Thank you. Good morning. Great to be speaking with you from Kaukopakapa, just north of Auckland. By way of background, look, I head up the international business for Bank of New Zealand. I've been involved with the Investor Visa program for 14 years. We provide support to families that are navigating their way in the traditional sense. So typically providing banking and investment management to meet visa requirements. But as a result of that work, we've developed a unique observation point and see the many challenges that families have, but also the potential and the personal goals and aspirations that they bring to our communities, which in my view really adds and contributes to New Zealand's longer term prosperity. And as a major New Zealand bank here, we reach into all regions and sectors of the New Zealand economy, and now playing a much greater role beyond traditional banking, with an ultimate sort of purpose of building a stronger New Zealand. And for new migrants, I recognise that, being in the space for quite some time, that sourcing information, insights, research, finding those networks, understanding the options available is not easy and it takes time. So today's topic and presentation is an example of how we can provide that support via our sister company, Jbwere. So I'll hand over to our presenters shortly, but just to provide some context around the relationship between BNZ and Jbwere. So we share the same parent company, which is the National Australia Bank. This allows us to collaborate in areas that are complementary to both organisations and our customers' interests. And we're very much in a privileged position to be able to contribute and help families better understand the for-purpose sector and to personalise their giving in New Zealand. Now on Jbwere, Jbwere is a leading provider of investment management and philanthropic services to the for-purpose sector in New Zealand and Australia. Currently entrusted with funds under management of just over 12 billion for purpose-led clients. So on that note, I'd like to introduce our two presenters and the co-authors of the New Zealand Court Report. We have John Morrow, who's joining us from Auckland, where he's the head of philanthropy for Jbwere New Zealand and has over 20 years experience in supporting philanthropic individuals and families, as well as for-purpose organisations. Our second presenter is John McLeod, who's joining us from a much earlier time from Melbourne, where he's the leading light in philanthropic and for-purpose research in Australia and the co-founder of the Trans-Tasman Jbwere Philanthropic Services team, which is now in its 21st year. So the two Johns will offer some highlights of their findings in the recent New Zealand Court Report, then turn to providing some observations on the interests of New Zealand philanthropy relative to peers in the UK, Australia, Canada, and the US. And they'll conclude by briefly touching on some of the impacts of COVID disruptions on the New Zealand not-for-profit sector. So on that note, I'll hand over to you, John McLeod, and we can get that presentation underway. Thank you.